and county as they expend money to rehouse those who are unhoused. We still have a lot of questions and a lot of information to find out as to the backstory for the situation in our county, really in particular. So our three panelists today: Nicole Linder is Executive Director of the Marjorie Mason Center, Dawan Utecht, who is Director of Behavioral Health for the County of Fresno, and Dr. Amber Crowell, Associate Professor of Sociology at Fresno State. And I think congratulations are in order to you as well. Congratulations on your promotion at Fresno State.
Thank you.
Dr. Crowell has published and written much about evictions in our community. I believe that her data was the basis for the Fresno County Public Library display a couple of years ago regarding homelessness, and her work really inspired the visit of, tell me his name, who wrote the book Evicted.
Matthew Desmond.
Thank you.
Yes, it was his exhibit at the library.
Yeah. So we're looking at homelessness from three different perspectives, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to start by describing briefly the circumstances that result in the people your organization deals with who are in the process of becoming homeless or who are homeless, or in the case of Dr. Crowell, what are the circumstances that are causing evictions? I think we know some, but just in a broader sense. So let's start in alphabetical order. I think Dawan, you probably really like it when people choose that, right? You never have to go first, but we'll start with Dr. Crowell. Go ahead, please.
Sure, thank you for having me and for zeroing in on this issue. It's something that we're really concerned is going to be exacerbated when all of the COVID-related protections are lifted this summer, assuming that the state does not extend them. So as Marianne said, my work is focused on evictions. I work with a couple of organizations in this, based in the Central Valley and specifically Fresno, so Faith in the Valley and Leadership Council primarily. So for the past 2 years, we've been studying evictions in Fresno because the rate of evictions in Fresno is disproportionately high, even though we think of the California housing crisis as, San Francisco and LA, where housing costs are just astronomical. Fresno actually has a higher eviction rate than either of those places, because even though housing here is considered affordable, it's not affordable for the people who live here because we have high rates of poverty. So conditions before COVID were already pretty bad. The typical renter in Fresno is already what we call rent burdened, meaning they spend a large percentage of their income on rent. So this is anywhere from 30 is the official threshold for being rent burdened, 30% of your income spent on housing costs. But we also have a disproportionate amount of renters in Fresno who are severely rent burdened, meaning over half of their income is spent on housing. Most of these renters are families with children. They are most at risk of displacement usually because they can't afford the rent. So what we found in Fresno is that typically in a year, we see anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 formal evictions, meaning they go through the courts. They are what we call legally evicted. We also know, based on Matthew Desmond's research, who has studied evictions across the country, that what are called informal or sometimes illegal evictions can as much as double the amount of evictions that occur in a community. So this is most likely to happen to our most vulnerable residents. So these are people who are living in slum housing, who are very financially insecure. This is also undocumented families. So people who really have no recourse against a landlord when they are threatened with eviction. And so they can be evicted even if it's not legal at all. And landlords have a lot of different motivations for doing things like that. So in terms of the causes, I guess there's, the direct causes, which is usually unpaid rent. So the typical eviction is over unpaid rent, so over 80% is what we found. But we know that from talking to our legal aid partners, who we work with quite a lot, the people who actually help tenants when they are given an eviction notice, that while unpaid rent is the primary cause, and that's what gets filed with the court, it's also often the case that landlords have another reason, but it's just the easiest route to get a tenant evicted is to wait until the tenant misses rent, and then they file for the eviction. So one of the things we were doing in our research was observing eviction court prior to COVID. And so we were actually talking to tenants who would appear, and there were many cases, and most of them are mothers. Most of them are mothers with young children, where they would show us their pay statements and show that they've been making rent, and that one time they missed it, but then they caught up, and they tried to go to their landlord and say, here it is, and the landlord would not accept the late rent, and they would go file eviction. And so usually it was the case that they were waiting for the tenant to slip up on the rent, and then they would file for the eviction. So unpaid rent is the primary cause, but the larger structural issue is that, quite frankly, we don't have enough affordable housing in Fresno. So the most recent analysis that I know of is from 2018, and in Fresno, we have a 40,000 unit shortfall in affordable housing. So this is for a variety of reasons. You might be aware that Clovis, for instance, just was sued because they're not building enough affordable housing. So there's very deliberate policy decisions that are made in some jurisdictions. But it's also the way that we've developed as a metropolitan area. We have not developed enough affordable housing. We have not invested in the neighborhoods where affordable housing could be built. And so there are these larger political decisions and ways that we've developed as a community that have really left out our most vulnerable residents, and created a situation where they, quite frankly, have no choice. They're forced into housing that they can't afford, and then they're put at risk to be evicted. And just one more thing to add to that is that tenants have very little protection. So when they get that eviction notice, they don't have a right to an attorney. They don't have any legal representation when they go through the court process. Most of them go through that process by themselves, and they don't know how to defend themselves. Most of them do not, because housing law is complicated. And the majority actually never even make it to court because they're so afraid of what it will cost them that they just pack up and leave as soon as they get the notice. So there's very little protections for renters to get through that process once they get the eviction notice. So that's kind of the overview.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure we have a number of issues to come back to after your introduction. Nicole, can I ask you next, just to give us, some background on the clients that the Marjorie Mason Center sees who are homeless, and the background there.
Thank you very much. Nicole Linder, Executive Director of Marjorie Mason Center. Before I get started, I do want to give a big public shout out to Dawan Utecht. I don't know that many people realize that she has been carrying the heavy load in this space on behalf of the county, and specifically in the COVID response, which started literally the day after the shutdown. And so I have to really publicly thank her for leading that effort, whether or not it's even on her job description. She has taken it and just been a great leader of our community in this space, and been a good teacher for me personally. I joined Marjorie Mason Center about 4.5 years ago, and I didn't understand, I didn't know that there was going to be an intersection between homelessness and domestic violence. Like most people, I thought domestic violence was physical abuse. It was in a family household. It was a man beating a woman, a very traditional, narrowly minded understanding of what it was. And it became really, really clear that for most people we were going to intersect with, the ability to have a safe place to go was of critical importance to whether or not they were going to feel brave enough to leave, because in most cases they've been threatened to be killed, their kids, a lot of other threats to go along with leaving at all an abusive relationship. But if they don't have somewhere else to go that would be safe, that's another barrier. And we do hear that all the time. So our population specifically is assisting adults and children who are fleeing domestic violence. And that's all genders. I gave a scenario of my previous expectation, but we serve men, women. They don't have to have kids. They can be in any sort of intimate partner relationship that they are fleeing. And so we provide emergency, transitional, and longer term housing. The circumstances that they are dealing with, we talked about safety. So Fresno County, specifically the city of Fresno, of all of the 10 largest cities in the state of California, Fresno has the highest per capita calls to law enforcement for domestic violence. So our volume is high. From a housing service, there are lots of organizations that do lots of services for victims in our community. For housing, Marjorie Mason Center is the only dedicated provider for those services. So the volume is high, but the resources remain limited. This is compounded by the fact that you quite often don't see or quantify that the homelessness individuals that might be visible to a population that is housed aren't necessarily going to be families with children. They're not going to be victims. They will likely either stay in that home until they have a safe place to go, or they will be searching. So those are some of the complications. The laws that were set up to protect victims, the Violence Against Women Act, the Victims of Crime Act, those laws were put into place to protect victims. But sometimes what that does is that creates a barrier between information that policyholders need in order to enact solutions as far as volume perspective, because the data isn't always there. It doesn't always translate. And so those are bridges we're trying to bridge those gaps right now. So the type of people we are seeing are people who their own home, so the place where they have an ability to live, is unsafe. So their threat of being killed, sometimes that's how we look at a vulnerability on the street. What's the likelihood that somebody will die on the street? For victims of domestic violence, it's usually the likelihood that they'll die staying in their home. Domestic violence is all about power and control. So somebody that we are seeing usually doesn't have access to any of their own identifying information, finances, and such. So that's a little bit about the population we serve.
Thank you. And Dawan, how about a little bit from your perspective? And I'm sure that COVID-19 has seriously changed that.
I could give you more than a little bit. Much like Nicole, when I took this job, gosh, it's been 8 years ago now this month, I didn't understand the role that homelessness would play in my responsibilities, or that, you know, as what I thought a healthcare provider would also be a housing provider and a housing developer and a housing manager and all kinds of roles that you don't typically associate with healthcare. And so the people that we serve end up homeless for a variety of reasons. I think the go-to for the public is that it's solely because they're mentally ill or have a substance use disorder, but that really does a disservice to the complexity of the problem. And it presents that if we just gave them their mental health services or substance use disorder services, we would solve the problem, and allows the problem to go unsolved because that's not enough. My good friend, who many of you know, Lynn Ashbeck, often describes these type of complex problems that if they could be solved by any one sector, they would already be solved. And so I think that, you know, our response during COVID, while certainly didn't address all of the homeless needs, in fact, if anything, it highlighted the unmet needs, but any success we had that Nicole mentioned of housing over 400 people, sheltering them during the COVID pandemic in safe housing, was solely because we have a strong network of really dedicated and passionate people through the continuum of care and other community partners that have enabled us to do what we were able to do. And subsequently, through Project Home Key, also begin to create that permanent supportive housing for people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. But the types of, aside, and I really appreciate Dr. Crowell being on here, because I do think that we often forget that the lack of affordable housing in Fresno for the people who live here contributes to my population not being housed also. Even if we have social supports that enable them to have funding, they are the very first people kicked out if they cause any problems whatsoever. And often because of the nature of their health condition, that is going to happen without the proper supports. And so they are, at the lowest rung of people that a landlord finds as a desirable tenant. And so, we have to work a lot harder, not just to get them housed, but to keep their housing sustainable. And if they've ever been evicted or they lost a deposit or can't come up with a deposit, it's another barrier to housing. And so the types of things, though, that lead to them, certainly we have a huge issue with individuals aging out of the foster care system. They really oftentimes are left completely in a lurch if they don't have supports and a transition plan. And so that's an area we focus on. Individuals exiting the criminal justice system. We've seen a lot of that in the last few years with criminal justice reform. It's kind of the flip side of what many people have advocated for. But often, just like we did in the 50s and 60s with mental health, when we freed people from institutions, but we did not put the supports in place, we created a homeless population. And a similar thing is happening with people exiting the criminal justice system, particularly if they have a mental health issue, a substance use disorder issue, or even chronic physical health conditions. We have had state prisons leave people at the emergency department when they leave the criminal justice system, drop people off at the Poverello house as their discharge plan or release plan. And so that's another thing that we have to tackle. Certainly having a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder or chronic health conditions all on its own can lead to homelessness, but all of these other economic and other complicating factors have to be considered when you consider solutions. And the other thing I would say before I close with this piece is that there will never be enough money or resources to deal with problems at their most complex end. We've got to go upstream more and more. And in my department, that means getting into the schools and increasing access to care and reducing stigma and discrimination so people seek care, as well as having the array of services needed so that people have the supports they need to not end up in that place where living on the street they see as their best option.
Dawan, that's just a perfect segue into my next question, which is what or where are the crucial points where we could be preventing these people from ending up homeless? So I'm asking each of our panelists that same question. Where is it that we could make a change? Dawan, do you want to start with that since you were in that direction?
Well, the obvious place, for instance, with people aging out of foster care system, kids aging out of the foster care system, is to have a plan, right? To identify those youth, particularly those who have mental health issues or at risk of substance use disorder, and put those supports in place. And that's something that we're constantly working on. We're partnering or attempting to partner with Fresno City College, for instance, and one of our newer housing developments in partnership with the Housing Authority will be located near City College and focus on transitional age youth. and really put those supports in place. Permanent supportive housing for the people we serve is often what's required to sustain. And so we have a lot of those properties in development. We have a few in place, and I'm happy I have some of my behavioral health board members on here who have advocated strongly to not limit ourselves to those initial properties and really have helped push us to do additional strategies. So, we have multiple housing developments in development right now in different stages of construction. We had a groundbreaking last week in Clovis for Butterfly Gardens. We have the property at Shields and Blackstone. We have another property at Barstow and Blackstone. We have a property roughly at Cedar and Belmont, and partnering in properties along Blackstone as well. And so, that we need to continue that work and provide that supportive housing to individuals living there. Those supports are what help people sustain their housing. And, we don't require people to be engaged in services to access the supportive housing, but we feel that if they're in a supported housing environment, they're more likely to engage in services. And so the other place is that transition from jail to community. How do we better support? How do we have those warm handoffs so people both get identified as having needs and then connected and linked to those services? One thing that we've really pushed for and that's going to help us is some newer legislation enabling people to sustain their Medi-Cal while they're in jail or prison, and or if not that, have access to it 30 days before they exit. That has been a real barrier to people getting the services they need when they have no Medi-Cal and have to re-enroll and go through that whole process. It's hard to link them to necessary services. So really identifying those barriers and supporting people through that.
Just, can you give me an idea of the number, for example, of people aging out of the foster care system? I mean, what's that volume, and what's the number roughly of people who are leaving incarceration?
I don't have those exact numbers right now, but I'm certainly happy to get the specific numbers and provide them to the League of Women Voters. We have a large number of kids in the foster system comparatively across the state. And the other issue we have in Fresno County is, there's a real push right now on juvenile justice reform,
Right.
but there also has been a big push to eliminate some of the more restrictive settings that kids were in. And so the continuum of care reform that happened over the last several years that got foster youth out of group homes and into more home-like settings. I have referred to it, and I don't mean this sarcastically, as a noble cause driven by magical thinking. We often do things that make perfect sense and have almost zero chance of success the way we're currently structured. And so incentivizing families to house foster youth and paying the family to provide therapy to them is problematic at best. And but we have had in Fresno County, and this is a function also of housing costs and other things, we have a lot of places in Fresno County that house youth from other counties. And so just in the last few months, we've had 2 youth in crisis in our crisis facilities from other counties that have, really been challenging to manage, and along with our own youth. And we have, there's a definite increase in youth in mental health crisis right now with the pandemic and the issues with school and such. And so, there's just a lot of work that has to be done to align incentives and coordinate an array of services, because it's not just behavioral health services. There's social services and physical health and residential and just the love and support of people who care about you. And so, you know, just many, many challenges that it's irresponsible and ineffective to look at one sector to solve. It's not going to be solved.
And Nicole, to you, what are the crucial points where we could be preventing those victims of domestic violence from becoming homeless?
Well, I think just using that keyword is, how do we work towards preventing domestic violence? Because the only reason they're becoming homeless is because they are a victim of domestic violence, at least in the arena I am specifically working in. I saw some CDC data recently that said for women, 75 or 71% will experience intimate partner violence before the age of 25. And so by the time that they are in a long-term relationship, by the time they are living together, most likely, they've already been a victim and they've already experienced it. And so how do we invest in prevention and educating people, providing those wraparound resources at a youth level to talk about building relationships that are based on mutual respect and not power and control, will go a really, really long way towards all of their relationships. But quite honestly, again, it's not funded. It's not something that we've got some sort of a comprehensive plan. There's been legislation to where, for example, colleges and high schools now have to put hotlines on the back of their ID cards. So we're starting conversations. Prevention budget every year, our coalition asks for funds at a state level. It almost always gets cut for both domestic violence and sexual assault. So the investment of resources is minimal. And as Dawan said, we'll never have enough resources to adequately provide for people who need complete wraparound. And so we have to be intentional. One of our values here is that every place become a safe place. And whether it's doing trainings for workplaces, for faith-based organizations, one of our strategic plan goals is to provide trainings and supports for other CBOs and other partner organizations so that we are infusing this messaging across the counties so that we have young people who start to enter into relationships and immediately can start to recognize if maybe they're unhealthy and have supports in place to ask for help. We are still so conditioned about do's and don'ts in our lives. And sometimes we've all grown up with a different family structure. And there's a huge population of young people that don't feel that they can go and talk to their parents about certain topics. So how do we create safe people they can talk to and train up parents to how to have conversations across the board with their own kids. I heard a presentation recently. It was a human trafficking presentation, and I wrote it down, and it's kind of stuck with me because they said, train your kids to say, I made a mistake, but now I need help. Because I think for kids, the fear of telling their parents that they made a mistake drives them into not talking at all. And parents need to have some models that we weren't given on how to have that conversation with your kid when they come to you and said, I'm pregnant, I'm sexually active, I'm in a same-sex relationship. I mean, all the things that I have parents all the time. I have single dads who say I let their mom talk about that for whatever reason. Like, we still feel like there are topics that within the home structure aren't safe to talk about. And so we're punting it to the school systems, and the school systems aren't equipped with the tools and necessary and resources to address them holistically. Like, we're carving it into health curriculum that kids are taking in summer school, and then we move on. And so it takes a whole infrastructure conversation.
So I'm thinking about, two things occur to me as you answer this question. One is this push for police reform seems like some of the interactions between our police and our particularly youth, but maybe not just youth who are homeless, might center around the issue of domestic abuse. And that, if there were intervention at that time rather than a police presence, seems like one possibility. And then the other, as a former middle school teacher, I know how difficult it is to get educators to deal with controversial topics. And but I don't want to undersell the value of school counselors and the related staff that really do the yeoman's work of intervention when it comes to dealing with domestic violence, substance abuse, the conflict between parents and kids, and all of those things which you indicate as the touch points for people who become homeless.
Yeah, and that's really good, Marion, because I'm not saying that teachers should just add one more thing to their plate, but creating a response plan. Like how do people recognize what's going on? How do we teach it? How do we recognize if there's a problem? And then what is that response look like? So everybody within the pod of the structure, whatever that is, if it's a school, if it's an organization, a business, everybody knows how to appropriately respond. And it takes practice in our muscle memory, because you really don't ever know who that safe person is going to be. It could be the kid's coach. It could be the cafeteria worker. It could be the front desk. It could be really anybody. And so how do we know how do we create a plan that everybody kind of knows how to implement? I remember Dr. Crowell talked about evictions. Domestic violence is another high reason for evictions because of the police activity. It's illegal, but most people aren't equipped with the resources to know that it is illegal. And then it goes back to they're a vulnerable population and they don't know they have access to resources before it's too late and they're already evicted.
And finally, Dr. Crowell, what are the crucial points where we could intervene to prevent eviction? Seems like it would be before it gets to a court setting.
Yeah, it's both and. So I wanted to continue what Nicole just mentioned, because what was going through my mind is, again, from Matthew Desmond's research, is that part of what makes women and women with children especially so vulnerable to eviction is this issue of, calls to police over domestic violence incidents can turn into nuisance complaints, which then put them at risk of eviction, which actually puts women in a really, really, really difficult spot, because calling the police means you could lose your home. And that's a horrible choice to have to make, right? So there needs to be a different way to handle those situations. There needs to be more accountability so that women aren't getting evicted for asking for help. That's just, it's just morally wrong. It's completely wrong, but it happens. So in terms of what kinds of interventions we need to see to prevent evictions, currently we're focused on the courts with the work we're doing right now with Fresno City Council, because what's coming down the road this year is the eviction moratoriums are going to be lifted. And so in a lot of cases, it's already too late to kind of like stop the conflict before it happens. There are eviction filings waiting to be processed. So with Fresno City Council, they just passed last week a resolution to establish a right to counsel for tenants. And what we need to see coming out of that are all the pieces that we as a community proposed when we initially pushed Fresno City Council to implement this, which means that tenants, regardless of what the backstory is, should have a right to an attorney. So currently what the City Council is doing is developing a screening process that the city has first, where you have to basically demonstrate that you've been wrongfully evicted before you get access to an attorney, which is sort of like getting judged before you get to the courtroom. And so that's a problem for us, and that's where we're currently pushing back. So any way that, more voices can be lent to that process and how it's implemented, that's a big problem for us. But what we need to see are attorneys for tenants, because since the start of COVID, we have seen 3 or 4 different eviction policies come and go at local, state, and federal levels. It is incredibly confusing, even for advocates who are watching this stuff closely and reading all of the articles about it and all the breakdowns from legal experts. It's confusing. And so the average tenant, the average landlord doesn't really understand what the laws say right now. So we have seen in cities that have implemented right to counsel. In New York, they've had theirs for about 4 years now. Tenants who had attorneys, 90% of them got to keep their homes. So that's huge. You think 3,000 families go through the courts every year in Fresno, 90% of those could potentially stay in their homes if they had attorneys to help them, even in cases where they miss their rent, negotiate some kind of agreement with the landlord so that they can stay in the place until at least they find somewhere else to go. In Cleveland, I believe it was also like 93%. They've had theirs for about a year now, but that was based on 6 months of data. So we need to see that be fully implemented, and it's in process in Fresno, so we might see it soon. We also need to see more accountability when it comes to landlords. If y'all have been following Fresno Bee's reporting, it seems every 5 years we get this big investigative report of a slumlord complex where tenants are, losing their homes to fires, they're getting evicted, they get their rents hiked super high, and then they get evicted against the law. And the city's not enforcing the code that we have, the laws that we have. And so we really need to reform those policies and make sure that there's actual accountability and a process for tenants to complain while not being penalized for it, because they fear retribution. A lot of them won't speak up. They won't even speak to a journalist because they're so scared of being evicted for it. And then what the housing coalition that's forming in the Central Valley is really basing a lot of our policy advocacy moving forward on is what's called the Homes Guarantee Plan, which is very focused on investing in public housing, social housing, so housing that's community owned. Because if any of y'all are paying attention to the housing market in Fresno right now, we're seeing the consequences of a housing stock that is completely in the private market. And so we're seeing rents that are now like going above $2,000 a month, which is just unheard of in Fresno. No one, that typical family can afford that. And for first-time homeowners, buying a house right now is practically impossible unless you're willing to pay way over the value of the home, because there are so many outside investors and folks coming in with cash, and it's driving up the cost of housing as if it wasn't high already. And so it's become more apparent than ever that we need to protect the housing stock and turn it into a need rather than a commodity, because when it's commodified as it is right now, the market has full control over it, and people who live here who have no control over the market can't afford it. And so that's what you're going to see coming out of the housing coalition of organizations like Faith in the Valley, Leadership Council, Jakara Movement, is policy advocacy centered on those goals.
I just looked this morning and saw that the county has already received close to $14 million for rent relief, and has a pending block grant of another $15 million. And remains to be seen what the county is going to do with it. We've heard a little bit from the city. We in the league are anxious to see the numbers and where the money is going. And I think that that's an upcoming question for us, for the county. So.
You know what, Mary, if I can address that specifically, because we're wrestling with that here, because I'm watching local government do their best to spend the resources they're getting, but they come with a lot of restrictions. And so I think just understanding how the money comes, I know there's a deadline by the end of the year. And so it feels like you can assist with a month or two, but then where does that leave that family? So I having had those conversations, it is a lot of money. It takes a long time for somebody to become document ready to even move into housing. And so sometimes the extension of the use of those funds, like the deadline, would provide the local jurisdictions. And I'm gonna let Dawan speak more to that. It feels like it's like, here's here's a lot of money, figure out a complex problem, and you got to do it by December 31st, and make it work and sustainable.
Well,
Dawan, do you want to talk about it? I see your thing off.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, Nicole is right. Oftentimes we get funding that either comes with massive restrictions, or what I like to say, legislators decide that they know our problems better than us. They devise solutions to our problems, and then we're left to use their solutions to solve the problems we actually have. And so that's a little frustrating. I personally believe that in our area, we need to have very clearly defined goals by section of the city or council member district or supervisor area, with affordable housing goals, so that you know, we don't just put affordable housing in some locations and then they support the development of affordable housing with the proper amendments to the rules and such that create barriers to affordable housing. You know, when we've tried to develop affordable housing or even put facilities in different areas, of course, we deal with massive amounts of NIMBYism, which makes it super hard to meet the people's needs that we serve. And so I think that our elected officials need to use their authority to be accountable for the problems that our community has.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, we've just seen it time and again with the moving forward with housing. I mean, we have a couple projects currently now. If you live in the Fig Garden area, there are, you know, thousands of signs discouraging support for a proposed project. I'd like to open the floor for questions from our members, if you have any, for our panelists. Anybody?
I have a question,
Please,
Janice.
go ahead.
So if somebody wanted to actively become involved, I want to, but I don't have enough information or background in this subject. How would I go about joining something or starting something, given that I don't have that background to help make a difference? Time and resources.
Amber, I'm going to let you start because I think you're probably connected with a way that somebody could immediately become involved.
Yes, actually, this is a great time to bring up that Faith in the Valley will be holding a summer housing justice course. It'll be in the evenings. They haven't officially announced it yet, but I'm extremely happy to share that information as soon as it's out there and promoted. So I know it'll be, I believe, bi-weekly in the evenings, and they'll be talking about, you know, their vision for housing justice and making housing accessible to everybody moving forward. So I'll definitely share that info for you. It's geared towards community and folks who want to get involved.
Thank you.
Other suggestions?
Well, we do have a behavioral health board. We have a few members on the call, and we're always looking for new members, right, Carolyn and Francine? That's a way if you want to get involved in behavioral health. I will say that through our department, we'll be holding a housing institute through the Corporation for Supportive Housing, where we're hoping to educate potential developers looking to develop housing, utilize, you know, it's very challenging to access the different sources of funding to develop affordable housing. You know, you have to understand how to use tax credits, and there's different grants, and you have to have the right banks and what have you. Things, frankly, I don't know enough about, so we have to work with other entities. Certainly the Housing Authority understands it, but we've slowly but surely brought in additional developers like Up Holdings, which is doing the Butterfly Gardens, and RH Properties, which is just local guys who have a passion for this. And so I think we do need to broaden the number of people involved in developing housing and their focus in their areas if we're going to solve the problems.
Louisa, did you have a comment?
Yeah, first of all, I think this is an excellent presentation with the three ladies, and they really are representing folks on the ground that are in need of services. And I endorse everything that they've said. But the other thing that we cannot ignore here is minimum wage jobs do not cut it for people who want to make a decent living and pay for housing and the food and all the basic necessities that they need, that also the lack thereof also feed into many of the problems that the folks that these three ladies see over time, whether it's stress over income and it comes out as domestic violence or substance abuse or mental illness. I mean, it's all connected. So we cannot ignore the call for raising the minimum wage and for diversifying our economy. An agricultural-based economy that barely pays minimum wage, service-related industries that barely pay minimum wage are not going to cut it. We really need to get to, the call has been for $15 an hour. We need to, and that's double what we currently have, because families can be making $7.50 an hour and still not be able to afford a house or an apartment at $750, which is now ballooned up to $1,200 a month or $1,300 a month. And then you're stuck in these communities that have been neglected over the years by the elected officials because of NIMBYism or because growth is going elsewhere. We're not investing in these neighborhoods where we're relegating poor folks to.
And even at $15 an hour,
Yes.
can the rent be paid at the rate that we see the rents
No.
now?
No.
I mean,
We also need affordable and adequate childcare.
Yes.
It's a huge issue that I think also contributes to the problem, because if you can't afford, childcare is ridiculously expensive. And particularly through the pandemic, we've lost a lot of childcare providers. I know that Linda Gleason is on this call, and that's something she's advocating for. And someone mentioned it, there's a lot of money coming into our community through the American Rescue Act and parts of the May Revise. And I always refer to it this way: we need to quit putting barnacles on our ship, right? We just add things and programs based on these categorical funding we get. And we don't really, critically and strategically say, how do we globally improve? And I will say that Cradle to Career and Drive really has tried to create a path forward that considers holistic approaches to our community's issues and families' problems. But Luisa's comment about fair pay, well, also you have to have the ability to pay for childcare if you have two parents working. And that's a huge, I often hear my conservative friends complain about, welfare and those types of things, but that's an investment in a family. We need to make those types of really strategic investments in our community.
and we see now with the president's infrastructure proposal that, the inclusion of such things as childcare and care for elderly and such being denigrated as not part of as infrastructure. And I think, it's critical to realize that following COVID, getting families back to work and getting kids back in school is really a child care issue. I mean, parents cannot work if their kids aren't cared for. If they could be cared for outside of school, that would be great, but they can't. And so the push is on for school. And that may not be really what we need.
I really appreciate that this conversation has extended to other ways that financial burdens can be lifted. So I just wanted to also highlight, as we're talking about just getting more financial support to families, that Governor Newsom announced matching funds for universal basic income programs if local governments pass them. So that's something else, that just getting cash to families, it really is that simple. We've seen the data out of Stockton now that it was extremely successful. Families know what to do with their money. They really do. And on the subject of childcare, I appreciate that too. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so I know exactly how much childcare costs post-pandemic. If we did full time, it would be $31,000 a year, which no one can afford. I can't afford. And so we're actually going part-time, going back to post-COVID normal, because it's unaffordable. It's absolutely unaffordable.
Thank you, Amber. Marianne, if I can try to answer the question, having been a newbie in this space, I would just encourage, if you want to know things you can do that cost nothing, participate in the Fresno Madera Continuum of Care meetings, learn what's already being done, listen in on the Fresno City Council and the County Board of Supervisors meetings, scan through the agendas and learn what's being presented and the plans being presented and the budget items that are impacted. We're talking to the League of Women Voters. Look at what's being presented through the lens of women and say, how does this plan, how do these resources address the needs of homeless women? And so that would be my encouragement to you. It's something that, I've been advocating for, just, making sure that there are resources for women with children. Because quite honestly, those are a little bit more of expensive types of services, because you need to be able to keep a whole family together in a single unit space. Families in general, intact families, they don't have to be just a single parent family, and how to expand those, I think are super important. And just continue to advocate for those, both at a local, and state and federal level. The May the May budget was great. It left out all language regarding domestic violence housing, all. And so there are ways that you can advocate, and those don't cost anything.
So we do publish weekly a list of ways to become engaged. I'm going to add the Fresno Madera Continuum of Care meetings. Those are not on my list. If there are other bodies, the Behavioral Health Board is on our list, as is the City Council and the Board of Supervisors. But if there are other groups with whom we might engage, you can just send those that information my way, and I'll be glad to include those.
Marianne,
Yeah.
let me jump in on
Please.
on expenditures. So right now, budgets have been developed in the month of May and in the month of June at the City Council level, at the school board level. I think the county does basically a walkthrough, then they come back in September. But those decisions and where those dollars get invested are being planned for now, and they have to be up for public comment. And this is a wonderful opportunity to folks to take a look where those monies are going, not just the COVID related dollars, but regular ongoing. And you hear police and fire clamoring for more money and everybody else, but what are we doing to improve the conditions in our communities that provide safe places, that develop youth and have, the whole social determinants of health issue. And so now is the time to be engaged in those kinds of discussions.
And Linda Gleason writes in the chat that annually there are about 100 foster youth aging out at 18, with many going to AB 12 extended care. And that's from the Department of Foster and Homeless Youth. So that was an answer to the question I had raised. As we approach the 1 o'clock hour, anybody have a last word, last question?
The one other thing I would be remiss in not mentioning is the role of racial inequities in homelessness. And a lot of the things that we talked about feeding into homelessness are driven by racism and systemic policies that created those inequities. And we don't often hear about the inequities in homelessness around cultural and other, including LGBTQ+. And so if we're not willing to confront that, we're also not going to solve the problems.
No, but the whole conversation about affordable housing and it just is, in my opinion, race-based. I mean, it just is really horrendous if you attended any of the local meetings to hear the comments and even to see the signs in front of, all throughout the big garden. Let's see, I have one more.
Yeah, in one of the chats, it brought up veterans and homelessness, and we do have a high While they don't comprise the largest number of homeless, if you look at veterans overall as a population, they're more likely to be homeless. Veterans often have experienced significant trauma. And when it goes unaddressed, as we know, I see Howard on here, unaddressed trauma often results in a sequelae of problems, including mental health issues, substance use disorder, and homelessness. And there has been a concerted effort in the housing environment to create housing for homelessness, but there's more work that needs to be done. And it is definitely on the radar. As I said, there's some separate funding and separate efforts. I know that the Housing Authority created a veteran-specific housing property across from the Veterans Hospital, but just like every other population, we still have unmet need. And so that is another population that feeds into the homeless pipeline, if you will.
So if I can summarize our marching orders following your presentations today, we need to be involved. We need to step up to attend those meetings of those bodies that have decision-making power, and in a lot of cases have money right now. There are issues much beyond homelessness that are at the base of our issues in town. The creation of high-paying jobs, skilled labor force that's able to command and demand a livable wage. That's a concern. Thank you so much to our presenters today for spending this hour with us, for kind of widening our view of a problem we see, sometimes just as a tent on the corner. And really, there's much more to it, as we know.
Miriam, before you hang up, I just want to make a quick announcement. Our top 10 women nominations will open June 1st. I know we have awesome some of our alumni on this group today, which is awesome, and we're so proud of them. But it's really important, and I feel like the highlight of my job, because I feel like I deal with sad stuff all the time, is to highlight amazing women in our community who are doing groundbreaking and fantastic work. And it's a joy to have that space where we get to lift them up. So I just ask for you to look out for that and to just make sure you take the time to nominate people this year.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Others? Anything else? Well, thank you all for joining us today. Dawan, Nicole, and Amber, thank you very much for your expertise. We'll be talking to you, I know for sure. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.